Saving the Appearances, A Study in Idolatry, 2nd edition. Chapter 16, Israel. We have been tracing the gradual disappearance of participation, and hitherto, save for a passing reference in Chapter 10, we have considered it only in relation to the growth of that alpha thinking which first began to play a predominant part in human consciousness with the emergence of Greek civilization from the Orient. But while this was going on, there was another force, quite independent of it, at work in quite a different way to produce the same result. This was the religious impulse of the Jewish nation. And although the two impulses operated to produce the same result, there could hardly be a greater contrast than that which we find between them. Turn from an Attic chorus or a Platonic dialogue to, say, the 104th Psalm, and you are at once in a different climate of soul altogether. More than that, you are among different representations. Thou deckest thyself with light, as it were with a garment, and spreadest out the heavens like a curtain, we read in verse 2. And for a moment we are inclined to feel that the psalmist, too, is experiencing the representations as representations, and the world as a theophany. But as we read on, we are impressed more and more with the enormous difference between this world and the world either of Greek or medieval man. If we seek a parallel in Western literature, we shall almost find it more readily in a later age when participation had nearly vanished. Traherne, perhaps, or even Walt Whitman. For here is not only no hint of mythology, but no real suggestion of manifestation. Everything proclaims the glory of God, but nothing represents him. Nothing could be more beautiful, and nothing could be less Platonic. The high hills are a refuge for the wild goats, and so are the stony rocks for the conies. But it is not, we are made to feel, by contemplating these phenomena that we shall rise to the contemplation of the invisible divinity who brought them into being. Here, too, the appearances are indeed grounded in divinity, but they are not grounded in the same way. They are not appearances, still less names, of God. They are things created by God. There is, in short, nothing to suggest immanence, and everything to suggest the contrary. If, moreover, we review the Old Testament as a whole, we shall scarcely find there suggested what we find assumed by both Aristotle and Aquinas, namely, that knowledge of God's creation can become knowledge of God. In the Old Testament, the relation of man to God is the only thing that is of any importance at all, but it has nothing to do with detailed knowledge, unless by that we mean a knowledge of the moral law. Of knowledge, as conscious participation in the divine ground of nature, and thus in the Spirit of God himself, we hear no whisper. The Jew could rejoice in the appearances, but he was not curious about them. He was not interested in them. He was, above all, detached from them. We have seen that before the days of hypotheses to save the appearances, knowledge was inconceivable except as a form of participation, and we cannot resist the conclusion that this detachment from knowledge arose, in the case of the Jews, not so much from any want of mental alertness as from a positive objection to participation as such. We cannot resist this conclusion because the whole history of the race, from Exodus onward, is the story of that chronic objection. Participation and the experience of phenomena as representations go hand in hand, and the experience of representations as such is closely linked with the making of images. The children of Israel became a nation and began their history in the moment when Moses, in the very heart of the ancient Egyptian civilization, delivered to them those 10 commandments, which include the unheard-of injunction, "Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. This is perhaps the unlikeliest thing that ever happened. As far as we know, in every other nation at that time, there prevailed unquestioned the participating consciousness which apprehends the phenomena as representations and naturally expresses itself in making images. For the Jews, henceforward, any dealings with those nations were strictly forbidden. Everywhere throughout the world, original participation was in full swing. For the Jews, from that moment on, original participation and anything smacking of it became a deadly sin. And what is the Old Testament but the tale of their long struggle against that very sin, their repeated relapses, and their final victory? By the Jewish nation, participation was even apprehended as a kind of incontinence, and it often involved incontinence in the narrower sense. Call before your mind the picture of Phinehas in Shittim, seizing a javelin in his right hand and staying the general relapse into idolatry by transfixing his compatriot in the very arms of the Midianitish woman. And you have a device which will serve well enough for Israel's escutcheon. As Pallas Athene, newborn fully armed from the brain of Zeus, will serve as a device for the Greeks. To be intensely aware of participation is, for man, to feel the center of energy in himself identified with the energy of which external nature is the image. Thus, in the religious aspect, original participation has always tended to express itself in cults of a phallic nature. The proper role played by the phallic emblem, as image of man's participation in a nature apprehended, as later also in myth and poetry, as female, may be easily conceived. The degeneration of such cults into orgiastic rites and excesses is equally easy, or, for those with no understanding of participation, much easier to imagine. The brute acceptance of phenomena at their face value, which was contemned by Plato, is paralleled, in the sphere of the will, by the sensuality which seeks repose or self-extinction in the contacts of the senses taken as ends in themselves. Both are the passive expense of spirit, replacing its active manifestation. Moreover, participating cults naturally cluster about man-made images. Artificial representations evoke and focus the experience of nature as representation. The grove is rendered more numinous by the idol in the grove. Thus, the ritual avowal of participation was closely associated with the worship of idols, and the second commandment, already quoted, concludes with the injunction, "Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them." Indeed, the Jews were not only forbidden to make images, they were not only forbidden to adore or to serve them, they were enjoined to destroy them. Ye shall destroy their altars, break their images, and cut down their groves. Now in this book, I have consistently applied the term idol to the collective representations characteristic of today. I have even defined it, for my purposes, as a representation or image which is not experienced as such. But the heathen idols which the Jews reprobated were experienced as such. They were participated. It may be felt, therefore, that the term was ill chosen. The answer to this objection really lies in the book itself, taken as a whole. Indeed, it is the book. But the following observations may not be out of place here. In a wider frame of reference than hitherto adopted, idolatry may be defined as the valuing of images or representations in the wrong way and for the wrong reasons, and an idol as an image so valued. More particularly, idolatry is the effective tendency to abstract the sense content from the whole representation and seek that for its own sake, transmuting the admired image into a desired object. This tendency seems always to have been latent in original participation and, If we could peer deep enough into the foundations of the world, we might find it written there that alpha thinking itself is one of the forms it takes. Perhaps the noblest, certainly the subtlest and most lasting form. At all events, the word idol has long come to denote not the image as such, as the Greek eidolon originally did, but the image on its way to becoming an object. It does not, therefore, seem to me to be stretching its meaning unduly to extend it to images which have finished that journey. Striking, as the Jews did, not only at the practice of idolatry, but at the whole religion of the Gentiles centered round it, their impulse was to destroy not merely that which participation may become, but participation itself. Original participation is, as pointed out in chapter 6, the sense that there stands behind the phenomena and on the other side of them from man, a represented, which is of the same nature as man. It was against this that Israel's face was set. The devotee in the presence of the totem feels himself and the totem to be filled with the same manna. They are, both of them, stopping places for manna. It was this state of affairs which Israel consciously arose to destroy. The idols, their psalmist insisted, were not filled with anything. They were mere hollow pretenses of life. They had no within. Their idols are silver and gold, even the work of men's hands. They have mouths and speak not, eyes have they and see not. They have ears and hear not, noses have they and smell not. They have hands and handle not, feet have they and walk not. Neither speak they through their throat. And as to their representing anything of the same nature as man, he added ominously, They that make them are like unto them, and so are all such as put their trust in them. There is, accordingly, the deepest imaginable contrast between the non-participation achieved by the children of Israel under the leadership of Moses and the non-participation achieved by the pagan and Christian West under the influence of Aristotle, although the former accrued in the course of time to the latter. We will here consider three special differences. In the first place, there were no geometrical or mechanical hypotheses to render the appearances idols in the sense in which the word is used in this book. If the children of Israel were enjoined not to worship the sun or the moon or any other star, it was because they were tempted by the glory of these appearances to do that very thing. They refrained because they were commanded to refrain, not because they had been educated to see the greater light and the less as a ball of gas and a ball of rock, which just happened to be there. It was not, in other words, a materialist non-participation. Secondly, their collective representations were necessarily involved with and colored by their language, and the ancient Hebrew tongue has a vocally representational quality which far exceeds that of any European language living or dead. I shall return to this aspect in a subsequent chapter. The third difference cannot be displayed in quite such a summary fashion. According to the Old Testament, shortly before the Israelites took their departure from Egypt, the name of the God of Israel was for the first time revealed to them through their representative Moses. And about this name, two things are to be particularly noted. It was regarded as, for the most part, too holy to be communicable. Thus, although in the Psalms, for instance, it will be found written, where the word Lord or God is written in the Authorized Version, yet when it was read aloud, other names such as Adonai, Lord, or Elohim were, at all events by the 3rd century BC, vocally substituted. The name itself was pronounced only by the priests in the temple when blessing the people or by the high priest on the Day of Atonement. Other precautions and uses emphasized and preserved its ineffable quality. Typographically, the name is represented by 4 Hebrew consonants, Etymologically, it represents a slight modification of the Hebrew verb to be, which also suggested to breathe. In Exodus 3:14, the first revelation, the first person singular of this verb, Yahweh, occurs twice, as a verb, I am that I am, and once as a noun, thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, I am hath sent me unto you. In the following verse, the third person, Yahweh, perhaps the nearest equivalent in English sounds of the so-called tetragrammaton, is substituted. And God said moreover unto Moses, Thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, Yahweh, God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, hath sent me unto you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial unto all generations. The Hebrew word for Jew may be similarly rendered Yahdi. The texture of the language hints that a devout Jew could hardly name his race without tending to utter the tetragrammaton. Written, as all Hebrew words were, without vowels, when any true child of Israel perused the unspoken name, Yahweh may have seemed to come whispering up, as it were, from the depths of his own being. That this, or something like it, was increasingly the case is at least suggested by the progress we note between the accounts in Exodus 3 of the experience of Moses and that given in 1 Kings 19 of the experience of Elijah on the occasion of their encounters with God. The angel of the Lord appeared to Moses in a flame of fire and out of the midst of a bush, and then the Lord himself called to Moses out of the midst of the same bush. But by the time of Elijah, the withdrawal of Israel from participation was already far advanced, and we are given instead, in the well-known verses, a crescendo of appearances in each of which God was not. And behold, Yahweh passed by, and a great and strong wind rent the mountains, and brake in pieces the rock before Yahweh, but Yahweh was not in the wind. And after the wind was an earthquake, but Yahweh was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake a fire, but Yahweh was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice. This ingathering withdrawal from participation, to which the Old Testament points, was clearly then a very different matter from that ousting or suppression of participation which Alpha thinking has subsequently accomplished in the Western world. Indeed, it might with equal truth be described as a concentration or centripetal deepening of participation. As to the glories displayed in the 104th Psalm, God was no longer in them. They were no longer his representations or names, for he had now only one name, I am. And that was participated by every being who had eyes that saw and ears that heard, and who spoke through his throat. But it was incommunicable, because its participation by the particular self which is at this moment uttering it was an inseparable part of its meaning. Everyone can call his idol God, and many do, but no being who speaks through his throat can call a wholly other and outer being I. Herein lay the mystery of the divine name. It was that name in which there is no participation between the Creator and any thing else. So wrote the renowned Jewish rabbi Maimonides in about the year 1190. And again, all the names of the Creator which are found in books are taken from his works, except one name, the Tetragrammaton, which is proper to him, and is therefore called the name apart, nomen separatum, because it signifies the substance of the Creator by pure signification, in which there is no participation. His other glorious names do indeed signify by participation, because they are taken from his works. Rabbi Moses ben Maimon, Moreh Nebuchim, quoted by J. Drusius, a 16th century scholar, in an essay on the Tetragrammaton. 17. The development of meaning. In the course of this book, many scattered references have been made to words and language. it is desirable that some attempt should now be made to draw the threads together. When we are disputing about the proper meaning to be attached to a particular word in a sentence, etymology is of little use. Only children run to the dictionary to settle an argument. But if we would consider the nature of meaning and the relation between thought and things, we cannot profitably dispense with etymology. It is long since men gave up the notion that the variety of natural species and the secrets of their relation to each other can be understood apart from their history. But many thinkers still seek to confine the science of language, as the Linnaeans once confined botany, within a sort of network of timeless abstractions. Method, for them, is another name for classification, but that is a blind alley. Now, etymology depicts the process of language in time, and it is a commonplace of the subject that whatever word we hit on, if we trace its meaning far enough back, we find it apparently expressive of some tangible, or at all events perceptible, object, or some physical activity. Understanding once meant standing under, and abstractions like concept and hypothesis merely disguise, in the garb of a dead language, a similarly humble origin. Even right and wrong are said to have once meant straight and sour. In much more recent times, we can observe the evolution of a great deal of the emotional and psychological meaning in contemporary words out of an astrological, chemical, or physiological past. Many people are aware, without turning to a dictionary, of what disposition, influence, melancholy, etc. used to mean, and I have already referred in Chapter 12 to the fact that similar changes are still going on in the case of such words as heart and blood. It would be in line with the general process of etymological change if, in future, the meaning of heart should become purely emotional, some other word such as cardium being appropriated to the physical organ. Here and there, it is true, we may observe a change in the opposite direction, and it is certainly striking that the most abstract of all terms, relation, should have become capable of signifying a solid three-dimensional aunt or cousin. But these are the rare exceptions. Throughout the recorded history of language, the movement of meaning has been from concrete to abstract. I am here using the word abstract in its broadest and admittedly vague sense to cover everything in the familiar world we talk about, which is not actually or theoretically accessible to the senses. Everything which a 19th century logician would have termed an attribute, and which some 20th century philosophers classify as a mere part of speech. In this sense, melancholy and a kind heart may be as much abstractions as concept and hypothesis. It depends how we think of them. How we ought to think of them may be disputed, and indeed, I am engaged in disputing it. But it is enough for my present purpose that nearly everybody today thinks of them as divorced from the appearances of nature which are accessible to the senses, in a way which nearly everybody before the scientific revolution did not. Systematic reflection on the history of language can hardly begin before the second half of the 19th century, when idolatry, as we have seen, was already near its culminating point, and when it had already, as described in Chapter 9, distorted the picture which men formed of the remote past. It was against this background, therefore, that the philologists of the 19th century sought to account for that unmistakable semantic progress from concrete to abstract, from outer to inner, to which I have just referred. In those circumstances, their answer to the problem was metaphor. Before speech was invented, they said, primitive man lived in a world, except for details, very much like ours. His next step was to invent simple words for the simplest things he saw about him, trees and animals, the sun and the moon, and so forth. And then, when his reason had evolved, he found he needed words in which to express his inner life. He used these simple words again, but this time as metaphors. Herbert Spencer and Max Mueller went further than this and added that, later on, men made the mistake of taking their own metaphors literally, and that this was the origin of mythology. Mythology, said Mueller, is a disease of language. Of course, as time went on, they said, the metaphors faded. We no longer call up any mental image of standing beneath when we use the word understand, or of a physical pressing out when we speak of expressing a sentiment or an idea. The progress was assumed to be from the metaphor through the trope, which is a kind of moribund metaphor as we speak of following the thread of an argument, to the ordinary straightforward meaning. But whatever meanings its words might bear today, language was considered historically as a tissue of faded or dead metaphors. Now there is no doubt that in the last few centuries, the meanings of quite a number of the words with which we endeavor to express psychological facts or opinions have come into being in just this way, by deliberate transference from the outer world to the inner. Emotion is probably an example, but it is equally certain that the great majority have not. If we look into them, we find that they point us back not to metaphor, but to participation, whether, like disposition, influence, and many others, through astrology, or whether, like temper and humor, through the old physiology, or whether, without being traceably connected with any particular system of thought, in one way or another, they stem from a time before that exclusive disjunction between the outer and inner, which the term metaphor presupposes. Such is the case with many of the oldest words in the language, like heart and blood, to which I have already referred. Moreover, many such more recent words, to which a simple metaphorical origin may be hastily attributed, will be found on closer examination to betray similar birthmarks. Depression, for instance, would seem at first sight to be in the same class as emotion, but the evidence collected by the Oxford Dictionary suggests that its psychological significance did not, in fact, originate in a spatial metaphor, such as we use when we speak of being on top of the world, but as a literal description of the state of the vital spirits. Many years ago, in a book called Poetic Diction, I drew attention to another fatal objection to this theory, that words which today have a mental or emotional content acquired that content originally as a metaphorical extension of their meaning. It is this: if we find language growing more and more metaphorical, the further back we go into the past, what possible justification can there be for assuming a still earlier time when it was not metaphorical at all? Thus, Max Mueller postulated a metaphorical period, during which the progress from literal to metaphorical meanings must have taken place. But what is this but a purely arbitrary surmise? And is it not highly improbable? Why was such an assumption found necessary? Simply in order to make the evidence presented by the history of language fit in somehow or another with that evolution of idols to which I have referred in chapters 5 and 9. It would take a very long time to trace all the influences exerted by preconceptions of this nature on the theories which men have formed about the origin and development of language, and even on lexicography itself. They are most easily detected by the train of inconsistencies they have left in their wake. Take, for instance, the old philological teaching of the building up of inflected and complex words from simple roots of speech. Some languages, among which Hebrew is probably an outstanding example, are clearly formed about a relatively small number of consonant groups consisting of 3 or even 2 letters each. Here is the bare fact, but what we make of it is all too likely to depend on the preconceptions with which we approach it. If we have preconceived a world in which the earliest speakers were surrounded by idols in all respects like our own, we shall treat these consonant groups practically as words, and shall attribute them meanings which were wide because they were generalized from particulars. This is what the philologists did, and it is particularly interesting to watch Max Mueller relating this root concept, as it was presented in his time, to his theory of a metaphorical period, to which I have already referred. He invented a distinction between radical metaphor and poetical metaphor. I call it a radical metaphor when a root which means to shine is applied to form the names not only of the fire or the sun, but of the spring of the year, the morning light, the brightness of thought, or the joyous outburst of hymns of praise. Ancient languages are brimful of such metaphors, and under the microscope of the etymologist, almost every word discloses traces of its first metaphorical conception. From this we must distinguish poetical metaphor, namely, when a noun or verb, ready-made and assigned to one definite object or action, is transferred poetically to another object or action. For instance, when the rays of the sun are called the hands or fingers of the sun. The assumption is that men have had on their lips the roots and in their minds the meanings, very much as we have words and their meanings today, and then proceeded to apply them to a varied selection of phenomena. But as was pointed out in the book already referred to, this assumption is inconsistent in two respects with all that we know of primitive languages. Among very primitive and otherwise almost wordless peoples, very short words are exactly what we do not find. Anthropologists tell us, instead, of the hollow phrase, or long, rambling conglomeration of sound and meaning. Words grow longer, not shorter, the nearer we get to the end of our backward journey toward the origin of speech. Secondly, a word meaning to shine, in general, as distinct from any particular kind of shining, is the very thing which a primitive mind is incapable of grasping. Indeed, much simpler generalizations such as tree, as distinct from a coconut tree or a gum tree, are equally beyond it. If, therefore, in any language the roots were there from the beginning, then, whatever else they were, they cannot have been words devised by men for the purpose of expressing general ideas. I do not believe, then, that there is any such thing as a radical metaphor. But I believe that reflection on the working of metaphor may nevertheless be a good approach to reflection on the nature of roots. For it is the peculiarity of metaphorical language that, at first sight, it does often resemble very closely the language of participation, though upon closer examination its existence is seen to depend precisely on the absence of participation. It is, at all events, important to have made some such examination before we approach the wider question of the nature and origin of language.